We're going live now.
Okay.
All right.
Oh man, I used up all my energy now.
Welcome to the Lovecraft Easing podcast. And Langan, aren't you going to show us? You got to show us Godzilla on the air.
Godzilla is here for the interview with Michael Cisco today.
German Godzilla is here for some reason. No.
Sounded like Schwarzenegger.
That's how Arnold exactly Schwarzenegger got his start in films playing Godzilla.
Really?
And the short-lived I'm Godzilla series.
What are the things you learned?
Godzilla, I guess it would be.
Okay, well, this is the Lovecraft Easing podcast. It's April the 5th, 2020, and Michael Cisco is our guest. How are you?
Hi. I'm hanging in there. I hope everyone's okay.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, isn't it?
Yeah, very strange. Not in a good way either.
And then I got a guest panelist, John Langan. Hey, John.
Guten Tag.
The guest panelist is Godzilla with his translator, John Lang.
his anger translator.
That's right. He speaks kaiju, apparently. I never knew that you'd acquired disability, John.
All right. So, yes, John Langan. You may know him in passing. Michael is our guest panelist today. And let's see, we've got Rick and we've got Rich and Bridget. Matt here. Yeah, Matt's here. And Heather's here. So why don't we do like introductions just really, really quickly and then talk to Michael Cisco. So I'm Mike Davis with Lovecraft Easing. Rick.
Rick Lay writer.
Rich Bunting.
Hey, Rich Bunting, just fanboy.
That works. Bridget.
Hi, composer, artist. I make music boxes with creepy music.
Yeah, pretty cool ones too. Matt Carpenter.
Hi, I'm Matt Carpenter. I'm not Mike's hairstylist. Anyway,
What the hell?
the prize for today is a paperback copy of the tribute to C.J. Henderson, Arkham Detective Agency. It's a great book. I really enjoyed reading this. If you want to win it, you send an email to easingprizes@gmail.com. Put Arkham in the title, in the subject heading, and we will pick a winner in a couple weeks. Just so you know, I've got a bunch of books backed up, but I'm not going to send anything out till the crisis has subsided a bit.
Why?
Because I don't want to go out and meet people. Sad, man.
One left, right, Heather?
Hi, Heather, Sandpaper Daisy art, horror artist, and I'm sorry for the horns. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm just trying to keep my hair back. It's driving me insane.
I do the same thing. Yeah.
I
But
love
just, just not today.
Yeah.
All right. You know what? I was gonna introduce Michael Cisco, but John Langan, who is this guy?
Does anybody really know the answer to that question, Mike? Does anybody really know what's happening? No, wait. No, go ahead, Cisco. Introduce yourself. Cisco's one of my oldest friends, my dearest friends, and it gives me great joy to see him here. But that tells you absolutely nothing about his accomplishments as a writer, which are considerable. And so, Cisco, tell us about yourself.
Well, I am certainly the oldest person that John Langan knows. He usually hangs out with far younger people.
Isn't Laird
but no,
isn't Laird like 62 or something?
Yeah.
Laird is eternal.
So I said I'm your oldest friend. That's all. So who am I? Well, I'm a writer who's been around for a while, and I published a bunch of books. And I don't really. I've been a fixture at ReaderCon and Necronomicon for a while. I've published scholarly stuff about weird fiction, and I'm still chipping away at various projects on weird as well. And I know a thing or two about Lovecraft, not as much as John, but a thing or two about Lovecraft. That's a really reasonably good beginning, I suppose.
Actually,
All right. Well, I hope everyone's enjoyed this interview, and
It's been great, and I thought we covered a lot of ground today.
yes, absolutely.
Like you and I go so far back that I knew you when you wore colors.
Colors.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, John. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I'm gonna let John lead most of this. These two guys have been. I've known these guys for a few years now, but you guys have known each other for far longer, and I think John's probably not probably, far more qualified to interview Michael Cisco than I am. But just a couple of things. Uh, you've got a chapbook coming out soon, uh, right?
I do. It was supposed to be out by now, but coronavirus, of course, has interfered with a lot of people's plans, and so it was going to be published as part, and it still will be published as a part of the charitable chapbook series published by Nightscape Press. If people aren't familiar with this is a series of chapbooks that are published. The author selects a charity, and then about one third of the proceeds of the sales of the book will go to that charity. Anyway, this was supposed to come out the end of March, but now the printer is in a lockdown state, and so we can't get hard copies of the book ready to go. And of course, they have to come to me so I can sign them, and then go back to Nightscape before he can send them out to everybody. But the book has been up on the Nightscape site for a while for pre-sale, and they've just shipped ebook versions of the book to everybody who's pre-ordered it. So if you pre-ordered it, you would get a PDF of the book with the art and everything laid out just like the book right now, and then you'll get the hard copy when eventually it is printed. You'll get the hard copy with illustrations. It has wonderful illustrations. It's called "Do You Mind If We Dance with Your Legs?" is the title of the book, and it's a novella. Paul Tremblay was not kind enough to tweet about it today, and he said it was sort of like Los Angeles noir with a sort of David Lynch thing going on, and I don't think that's an unfair description.
Yeah.
That's what I've got going on now. That's the most recent thing.
Yeah, reading that, or even when I discovered you years ago, I always think of this Homer Simpson cartoon or clip where Homer's watching Twin Peaks in the dark. He's like, brilliant, brilliant. I have absolutely no idea what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. I knew that's where this was going. That's
Did you?
I guess. Yes, I did, because in a way, I've been at this long enough so that we could presume it's not an accident. But yeah, a lot of my characters are in a situation where they don't know what's going on, and I don't necessarily want to know what's going on too well myself, just because for me a lot of I don't know, I just find it's more interesting when I let the story tell me what it wants to do or where it wants to go. That's something interesting I could talk about there if it's not
No, talk about whatever you want to talk about.
too digressive.
Yeah.
But my wife is a filmmaker, and she suggested that I try to do this as like a screenplay, do a screenplay adaptation of Legs. And I wrote it up as a screenplay, and as I was writing it, this is before it was arranged to get it published through Nightscape. Was just doing this to do it. And I learned more about the story from rewriting it that way. And so I went back and revised the novella based on things I'd learned, converting it into a screenplay. And so that's what I like to do. I like to be able to discover things about what I'm writing as I write them, instead of kind of pinning everything out in advance. So it's very seldom do things really turn out exactly the way I originally conceived of them. But I don't regard that as a problem. It's sort of it's what I'm looking for when I write. And I think that you don't plan a dream before you have it, right?
Wow.
And so if
Yeah.
you're going to write sort of dreamlike fiction, you need to have the dream tells you where you're going, and you interact with the dream. You say, "Oh, that's what this means," and then you go in that direction, and then the dream says, "No, sorry." And but instead of losing interest, you are drawn in further, and so that's the kind of aspect of of the dream that I think connects very well with fiction in general. Fiction, in a way, is a type of professional dreaming, or dreaming on purpose, creating a shared dream that you can give to other people. I think a lot of fantasy or imaginative fiction begins with people just trying to describe the crazy stuff they saw in dreams to each other. And then someone says, if you could do that on purpose, you might have something there.
Well, first of all, I got Pete Rollick in here late, so Pete Rollick is here.
Maybe.
Too. Yep. I in regards to what everything you just said, Michael, I saw an old weird fiction review interview with you, I think it was, and I actually copied this down. With respect, this is you, I'm quoting. With respect to the struggle to read my work, I do make something of a religion out of difficulty per se, and I and I don't know that this is entirely to be despised. I want readers who are prepared to contribute something of their own to making the novel work, or whatever story I assume. I prefer this way of getting my work to live for and with them. I don't so much want to tell my readers things or to guide them through something. I want them to make something out of their something of their own, excuse me, out of what I've done, and I want my work to overwhelm them. That really struck me.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's only because this is the kind of work that I've always found the most exciting and the most challenging to read. And so when I'm reading something really great, I'm often baffled, like, how did they do this? How did this happen? Like, you're watching a movie, like, everyone's seen Eraserhead, I'm assuming,
Hmm.
right? How do you think of that? I mean, how do you just sit down and come up with that idea and then execute it that way? I can't really imagine how he did it. I mean, I know how he did it. He sat down day by day, plotted this out, he filmed it like so, but where did it come from? Is it just a set of common anxieties that have been kind of sort of disguised? Or no, it's not. It's its own story. These characters live in a world that actually feels real. I mean, it shouldn't, because it's so obviously stylized, but it does. And it's the you don't figure that out. I don't think you figure out how, you don't turn that into a recipe, but you can kind of try to figure out your own way to do that, I guess. And that's something I've struggled to do um, in my own writing. So I don't know. I don't want to make my stuff sound too heady, and I really dread being, uh, one of those writers who's just tiresomely formally fiddly, just because that's sort of a brute force way to look avant-garde. Like, I don't want to do that. It has to be like in Legs. It was really important that there always be a strong emotional core, that the main character was somebody who, even though he's very strange, uh, the point, you have to feel for this character, otherwise nothing works. You have to be invested in this person emotionally, or the story completely falls apart and just you don't care. So however weird it may be, at the same time it has to ring true. It can't just be weird for the sake of being weird. I mean, that sort of writing is deeply tiresome to me.
Or difficult for the
um,
sake of being difficult.
yeah, I mean, for the sake of it, yeah, I don't know. It's like, well, difficult. If you're just being difficult to prove how smart you are, it's like, who cares how smart you are?
Right.
Um,
Well,
if I'm
I
interested,
didn't know what was going on through all of all of Legs, but it also grabbed me. It kept me reading. It wasn't a beach read, but it was also compelling at the same time. You know.
yeah, that was the idea. It's like, and if it is compelling, it's because of the situation and because the characters are interesting, because the character psychology hopefully, seems plausible, real, even if it's unusual. Um, I don't know. For me, a lot of the reason I'm drawn to difficult stuff is that I find it difficult to understand the world that I'm in right now. I find understanding life very difficult, and I relate to people most, I think, when they don't know what to do and aren't sure what's going on and are struggling to figure it out. And and that's in a way, like, I never set out to write like a noir book, but that seems to me like a very noir condition to be in, where your noir detective character, you're sort of maybe not so much Sam Spade because he's a tough guy all the same, but you know, um, certainly when you're reading Chandler, or even the Continental Op for that matter, you've got people who they know who they are pretty much, but they take everything else with a grain of salt. They're very uncertain about everything, and they know that things aren't what they seem. And so, in a way, I'm interested. Okay, what if you didn't even know who you were exactly? Then where would you be? It wouldn't be a less noir situation. It would be some more noir. There'd be more to investigate, or you are the investigation more than you are the conclusion or the answer. Like, those stories are never about finding out who the murderer is. Watching those movies like The Big Sleep. Like, you can't understand The Big Sleep. Right? You've seen The Big Sleep. What's going on in that story?
The noir and the weird mesh pretty well. I remember, and then you can go, Pete. Sorry about that. I just want to, in regards to what you just said, I asked Livia Llewellyn one time what what is weird fiction, and she said things are not as they seem, and she said, and in addition to that, you are not what you seem, or you may not be what you seem. So, Pete, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So that's basically the theme of William Hertzberg's novel Fallen Angel, which was made into Angel Heart. And, I riffed on that in Looking for Johnny Chagas. Ultimately, that is, for noir detectives, that's the big reveal, right?
Hey, yeah, you're right.
Not solving the mystery of what's going on, solving the mystery of who you are.
Yeah.
And what you're, sometimes what you're willing to do.
Right. Or who you are in this world, what this world is all about. And yeah, I really want to, first of all, you brought up Livia, and, I can't pass over a mention of her without just affirming once again what a brilliant writer she is.
Yeah.
And I think an underrated one, frankly.
Yeah.
Everyone should read Livia. And she's right. And for me, weird fiction, my question going into weird fiction is always, okay, what is the wish fulfillment? Why am I reading this? Is it because I enjoy being frightened? No, I don't like being frightened. I don't. It's not true. I don't like being frightened. Is that really why I read it? And what I like about weird fiction is the way that it reminds people that experience doesn't have built-in limits. It doesn't have a definition. There's no guarantee that holds everything in place for you. It's all just sort of whatever it is. It's infinite in the sense of that, that it's not so much that anything can happen, but that there's something radically mysterious and unknowable about it. And the weird fiction reminds us of that, but in a way that's like, it has to erupt. The weird thing has to erupt in a really normal setting, like the conventional British countryside, the little village, the quaint home, where everything is super normal, totally predictable, never change. That's where you put the weird thing, because that's where it's most jarring, and you can make it really, really small. And it can cause everything to unravel. Like, I don't know if you know a story by, I think Peter Straub put it in that 2-volume collection of American weird fiction that he did for the Library of America Press. I think it was American Fantasy. I have it right here. And I show it to you. This is covered like this, American Fantastic Tales. Right?
Yeah.
There's a story in here called The Little Room by Madeline Yale Wynn. Does anyone know that one?
I don't think I've read that one.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. Yeah.
It's a gem. John, have you read it?
No, I haven't. Not yet.
I feel better. Langan hasn't read it.
I say that as if like, oh, not yet. I'm going to get to it tomorrow.
Right, Madeline Yale Wynn.
God, it's on my list. It's at the top of the pile. Damn it.
That was my reading for tonight. Damn you, Cisco, for embarrassing me.
Oh well. Oh, you do. So anyway, Madeline Yale Wynn's story.
Were you about to say he does it on his own, just fine? That's what you were going to say.
Yes, I was.
You'll get yours, Cisco. Don't worry. You and your Madeline Yale Wynn, whatever.
Wynn.
That story isn't even in that book. You're making it up. But go on. Go on with your invention.
It's not mine. I wish it was my invention. I only wish. It's a wonderful story. The premise is that there's this the main character is a woman. She's talking about her family. She has these 2 aunts who live together, and they're New England aunts who live in this house up in Vermont. And according to some people, there's this little room in their house, this little room with blue wallpaper. It's a totally normal little room, except some people see a little room there, and other people see a china closet when they open the door. So which is it? We don't know. The main character says that when she was sick as a child, she stayed in the little room for a while and recovered. She revisits the house as an adult and asks to see little room. And the aunts say, there's no little room in this house. They open the door, it's a china closet. And it goes back and forth like that. I'm not retelling the story especially well, but you get the idea there. There's no apparition, there's no ghost. there's no resolution of the story, and there's nothing at stake. It's not like one room is super scary. They're two normal rooms. There's just a china closet or a little room, but they're normal. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But sometimes you open the door and it's one, and sometimes you open the door and it's the other. And the two aunts, whenever you ask them, will always insist the house has never been changed, has always been exactly the same. If you saw a china closet, they'll say it's always been a china closet. If you see a little room, they'll say there's always been a little room there. I don't know what you're talking about. So you take an utterly ordinary thing like this house, and you just make one utterly ordinary thing swap out with another totally ordinary thing. There's no ghosts, there's no nothing else. It's just this one confusion. And that's enough to make you question everything you see. In fact, in some ways, it's more effective for not being especially sensational, not like a giant white poltergeist face that bursts out through the door and screams at you, but something very, very small is enough to kind of start unraveling your confidence, your assurance in the stability of what's going on around you. The Little Room by Madeline Yale Wynn. I recommend it, and it's short.
John, you want to take over for me for a bit? For a while?
Um,
Forever?
It's time for the questions.
Oh my God, look at that.
These questions will be asked by Zombie Spider-Man.
Oh, I didn't know there was a zombie Spider-Man.
There is Zombie Spider-Man. He was from the Kirkman did those Marvel zombies things, and there, King Caesar. Thank you. Well, if King Caesar appears, then Godzilla has to appear. Oh, nice, very nice.
Yes, my answers will be provided by Fritz with the abnormal brain.
Very good, very
from
good.
The original Frankenstein.
Abnormal?
Yeah, well, so Dwight Fry will be speaking for me on this occasion.
All right.
So wait, let's figure out if we can get even more obscure.
Ooh, that's nicely obscure.
Which is it?
Is that from Johnny Quest?
Yeah. Say something, Pete. That way you'll be on the screen.
Can you hear me now?
Is that from Johnny Quest?
So this is a monk from Jabba's palace.
Ah, nice. Okay.
Jabba's palace wasn't always Jabba's palace. It was this home for these monks that were disembodied brains in spider robots.
Lon Chaney Sr. has shown up.
From London After Midnight, but he can't talk because it's a silent film.
Oh, okay, all right. So he'll just have to provide all right. Whatever question I ask him, he'll just have the same expression on his face.
It's also a lost film.
That's
yes,
right.
London After Midnight. Wow, yeah.
Well, if you're going to bring him out, I'm going to bring Charles Dickens out, or maybe it may be Neil Gaiman dressed as Charles Dickens. We're not sure about that.
Well,
Everybody
right,
listening to this later is like, "What the hell?"
Then I guess I'll let the Virtual Friendly's Lovecraft with the periwig respond.
Nice.
Going
nice.
too far.
Yeah.
Here you go. I gotta throw mine out there since you guys are doing. Well, there we go. Yeah.
Oh, there you go, Poe. Okay.
Yeah, that was given to me by David Del Cole. Thank you, David. So, yeah.
So I don't know where my Van Gogh action figure is.
All right, so John, you wanna grill Cisco here?
And I fear that Sigmund Freud would be not out of place here.
I give you Eimer from Ragnarok.
Nice. Michael, tell us about your mother. No. All right.
I could tell people about your mother, but I wouldn't. Well, no.
Oh, wow. Okay, we're going there. All right. So there will be a couple of people watching this who will want to know about your background, those kinds of mundane details. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, where you grew up, what that experience was like? Did you always wear black, or is that like a new thing?
I was born wearing black.
And I know that you're from the West Coast originally. So when did you come east?
When did I come east? Okay, so this I guess can also be relevant to discussing legs. I was born in Glendale, California, which is in Los Angeles County, and one of the things I wanted to do in Legs was sort of write about Los Angeles, which is, it's a classic noir city, but a lot of people write about it as people who weren't born there. And my experience of the city is not of a glitzy, glamorous place at all. Although you were always dimly aware that somewhere out there they were shooting Star Trek or something. Somewhere over in Burbank there was a soundstage where all that was being shot, or out at the Vasquez Rocks. So in a way, the Legs was also a chance for me to write a kind of love letter to Los Angeles, which is a city that I miss. I grew up there, and I moved east to go to college. I went to Sarah Lawrence for 3 years. I did a study abroad at Oxford, and that I left California in 1989. I was born there in 1970. I died there in 1989, and
I knew it.
That's when I started wearing black to my own funeral, and I ended up living on the East Coast, pretty much all over the place. I was after Sarah Lawrence, I did my master's degree at SUNY Buffalo, so I was there for a year and change, and then I moved to the city, New York City, in '94, I think it was, for graduate school, and I've been teaching here. I teach at CUNY Ostos in the Bronx, where I've been teaching now full time for 12 years. So yeah, I've been on the East Coast for a minute.
So was it an accident, as it were, an accident? Like, was it just that Sarah Lawrence gave you the best deal, and as many college students do, you were just like, okay, it's Sarah Lawrence then? Or was there something about coming east where you thought, oh yeah, I really want to do that?
That's the thing. I mean, most of the schools I looked at were East Coast schools. I wanted to get out of Los Angeles and see something else, some other part of the world. And my mother was born in Maine, and we'd been back to New England a time or two, and she loves going back to New England and sort of reconnecting with her roots and some family. And so there was a familial bond to the Northeast, and that gave it a sort of intrigue to me. And also, Los Angeles is a very new city. Everything is new. It was even newer in the 70s when I was new. So I was kind of fascinated by the prospect of living in a place where there were houses that were centuries old. That's one thing that was interesting about Lovecraft, was that he kept reminding you how old the settlement of the America was, or at least he would always present it as antediluvian. The Puritan settlements, places like Marblehead, which are more or less the way they were, way back in the 1600s. And so, in the 1600s, California was basically an adobe shack or two. So, and under the Spanish crown, which is very strange to think about, actually. But anyway, so I was kind of, the East actually had a certain romance for me. And so I was interested in at least seeing it. I didn't come out knowing that I would pretty much end up living in the East. But
Right.
that was just largely a question of which schools took me.
Right. Now, I know that from conversations that we've had, that when you were younger, you were a huge Tolkien fan. Before Lovecraft, even, I think, right? So,
absolutely.
What did you discover Tolkien in California, or was he something that you found? So, what was the attraction there? Like what happened there? Because I think that the world building that you find in Tolkien, it seems to me there's a certain consonance, right, between that and some of the things that you've done in your own work. And with Lovecraft, there's this weird kind of almost intermediary or something. But anyway, so I just wanted to throw Tolkien out there, so to speak, and just give you a chance to talk about him.
Oh God. Well, I I was introduced to The Hobbit by the Rankin Bass adaptation of The Hobbit on television.
Yeah.
And I couldn't love that hard enough. And there was certainly no internet. There was no VCR. There was no nothing. There was network TV in those days. This was like 77, 78 when I saw it on TV. But I got the story record, and I would play the story record over and over. And we got the book, and I read it religiously. I read it over and over again. I couldn't read it enough times. I mean, I could talk about it indefinitely. I mean, it's still to this day, I'm amazed at how deeply into my DNA that book went. More so than I think The Lord of the Rings did. And what I liked, and even to this, like right now, I'm working on a fantasy novel, and I've worked on other fantasy books. And one thing I liked about the Hobbit was that it's such a local story. The Lord of the Rings is about the destiny of the world, and when it ends, like the magic all drains away, like all the elves are going, the wizards are going. I hated that ending. And it seemed like they've been working all this time just to get to an ending where we could say, okay, all this magic stuff goes away and we get a nice, boring, plausible human world. It's like, what do you think I was reading this for? To read about a human world? Like, that's what I want? What I liked about The Hobbit was that it invoked the world in so many different ways. But one of the most effective ways was that it was only about one little corner of it, one small character doing a local thing. And yes, there's a war and there's kingdoms involved, but it's all around this one mountain, this one coral, this one small manageable group of people. So when the kings all show up at the end to fight over the money, which is an amazing thing to put in a fantasy book, have people fighting over money.
Right.
And the elf king shows up and says, we want a cut. Like, it's like, where's our cut of this loot? And that's not very elf king like, but we've met all these characters before. We've interacted with them. There are no new characters introduced there. It's all elements from the story that have been brought back together again at the end, with, I guess, the exception of Dane, but he's not. We don't talk about him much. The idea of a local epic, like an epic in scope, totally engrossing for the characters involved. Like the whole world is at stake from their point of view. But at the same time, it's not like the whole world is at stake the way it is in, say, a Marvel movie now, where it's like the whole universe is at stake. And that just seems to, that kind of maximalism actually doesn't seem as epic to me as the local stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I teach the Odyssey, and the Odyssey goes everywhere basically the Greeks knew about. So it covers the world from the Greek point of view. But of course, from our point of view, this is just one small corner of the world. And so it's wonderful. It's their whole world from the point of view of these characters, but we're standing with a much broader vantage point than they have on their own lives. If you see what I mean, that's sort of, I'm not thinking this as a child. This is more like what I come back to the story for.
Yeah.
But as a kid, I was blown away by the idea that you could have maps on the end papers. Like you open it up and there's a map with Lonely Mountain, right? It's even supposed to be the very same map that they looked at in the story.
Right.
And the idea of like, first of all, I'm handling like an artifact from this world. That's a kind of a Lovecraftian thing to appreciate in a sense. But also too, the idea that you could draw a map of a place that didn't exist, to me as an 8-year-old or whatever, that struck me as very daring and audacious. It was like a bold fraud or a lie of some sort. Of course, I was a little naive. I didn't really know this had been done, but I could tell this was different from the maps and stuff in like the Oz books, which are more like charts, like it's a circle, and it's not schematic like that. It's supposed to look like a map. And I didn't understand, for example, that he didn't invent the runes. I thought he made those up.
Right.
I didn't realize that those were actual Nordic runes, although he was using them slightly differently. But of course, he did create his own writing systems for Elvish. And he did invent these languages, and I thought, Jesus, the sheer scale of that. I'm not just creating a fantasy world of just a few brief marks, like, yeah, dragons, blah, blah, blah. Now let's get into the action. It's like, no. There's all this groundwork that's got to be laid. We're going to invent whole languages. We're going to create a whole timeline. We're going to create a whole map. And to think on that scale really impressed me. And I never forgot it. So it was that, and then to write, at the same time, to write about a character who's really insignificant in this world, Bilbo Baggins. He's not a king. He's not a lord. He's a halfling. He's a hobbit. Nobody really knows who they are or particularly care. Like the elves have never seen one or haven't seen one for a long time. And to center everything on this rather little guy who has to make his way through this vast world, that contrast was very, I thought, artfully done. It helped to give the world a sense of scale, a sense of real presence. If that makes sense. And so those are the sort of things, like, again, I could just go on talking about The Hobbit forever.
So do you see when you got to did you get to, I presume you got to Lovecraft after Tolkien?
Yes.
So when you got to Lovecraft, do you find yourself responding to the some of the same elements, that sense that, with each story, Lovecraft is expanding that world and it just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, even as his rate of production slows down as he gets older, that there's still that sense of secondary worlds or worlds creation.
Yeah, and the thing that was interesting there was that it was our world that he was expanding. It wasn't a fantasy world over here, although Tolkien at times seems to suggest that somehow this is going to become our world, the world of men.
Yeah.
But there's no clear path for that to happen. Whereas Lovecraft is talking about the world we live in. And so I discovered Lovecraft when I was a teenager, like right around the time you really should discover Lovecraft, I think, when you're like 12 or 13. And you're starting to think that things aren't quite what they seem around you. Reading Lovecraft, it drew me in more and more and more because it had a way of re-enchanting the world I was looking at around me, suggesting that there are hidden depths. Just reminding you constantly, look, we live in we may have mapped out everything around us, but how far can we really see, and how far back does this go? We live in gulfs of infinite space and time. Who's to say what the hell is out there? You can keep expanding that proverbial island of ignorance that he talks about, that island of, what is it, in the sea of blackness, and it's an island of ignorance?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. You can keep making the island bigger, but that sea is infinite.
Yeah.
And so the bringing the infinite in all the time is, I think, kind of that cosmic aspect of Lovecraft that even in a simple domestic tale like The Thing on the Doorstep, there's still this cosmic telescoping outwards. It's not just that Ephraim Wade is walking around in Asenath's body. It's that, well, who's to say that was even Ephraim Wade to begin with? Who's to say this hasn't happened over and over again? Who's to say that the person you're talking to wasn't somebody before they were Ephraim Wade, and then maybe somebody before that, and maybe they weren't even human when it started? What am I talking to? And Lovecraft explicitly uses the words like cosmic hideousness and so forth in the story to show that this isn't just about a misunderstanding between a husband and wife. This is something that opens out. So it's the way Lovecraft his way of opening things out. Not just doing that, but he did it in a way that is Tolkien-like in some respects, or M.R. Jamesian too, through documentary evidence. This is the sort of thing that Borges picked up on, especially about Lovecraft. Documentary evidence, secondary sources, historical background, coincidences, pointing to certain aporias in the record and then filling in the blanks. The way you reconstruct actual history, which is also not present for us to examine firsthand. So we have to rely on secondary sources. So realizing that you essentially have to trust a secondary source to piece history back together, including things like your own genealogical history. And this goes back to what Pete was saying about not knowing who you are, right? That's of course a classic thing in Lovecraft. If you ever research your own genealogy in Lovecraft, you're just asking for trouble.
Yeah, that's a bad idea, isn't it? If you're in a Lovecraft story, just let it lie.
Let it slide.
It's good.
You're going to find a fish or an ape back there real soon, much sooner than you would expect.
Or a fish ape.
A fish ape. Why not? I'm positive that there was something like that being set up in The Lurking Fear that never quite came to fruition, but that the main character was going to find out he was secretly a Martense as well. But for whatever reason, Lovecraft didn't go there. But yeah, so like using that documentary evidence as a way of world building was really a wonderful aesthetic trope that he shared with Tolkien too.
At one point, one of the things that's always fascinated me about Tolkien is that apparently there's at some point he said that Middle Earth was so vast that he thought that he was going to need to invite other writers in to help him explore parts of it, and then the Tolkien estate was like, absolutely not. But but obviously that's what Lovecraft did, and in a sense continues to do. And I wonder, like, were you picking up on that too, that the sense that, oh wait, there were connections to whether Clark Ashton Smith or Fritz Leiber or whoever?
Absolutely. Like, that was the thing. Because he does it all through these kind of secondary sources, it's very inviting to get in on this game, and like to start making references to the Necronomicon, or the way he pulled in Clark Ashton Smith's Sathagua. And there wasn't any kind of, the whole point wasn't to create a coherent mythos, I don't think, because then you would end up having to exclude people and tell people what they could and couldn't do. And that doesn't seem to have been Lovecraft's interest at all. In fact, I think if I could project a little bit, I would imagine that if someone tried to quibble with Lovecraft on a point of doctrine, he would respond to it not by saying, well, I invented this and I know what's going on. He would resort to additional documentary evidence and make the controversy part of the verisimilitude.
Part of it, right.
And that's something I really like to do. Like, if I'm writing a fantasy novel like The Narrator, I don't want to map everything out exactly, because, I mean, we have maps and we have ideas of what the world is and what our history is, but these are controversial things. Even a map can be a controversial thing. You can say, well, this is part of our country, and another, in like Argentina says, no, the boundary's over here. So we don't all operate from the same exact idea of what our world is or our place in it or what our history is. These are all subject to ongoing controversy. So if I'm going to create a plausible imaginary world, then I would have to create one that was just as conflicted, where you'd have different parties arguing about what the nature of reality was, what the history was. Well, we're the heroes of this story. No, we're the heroes of this story. The outlines are this way. No, they're over here. So yeah, I wanted it to be, it would have locally produced coherence, right? With drawing out of a field of possible facts, which struck me as a more realistic way of depicting a fantasy world.
So was this around the time? Like was it when you read Tolkien or Lovecraft? Like, were you already thinking, I want to write, or you were writing, or was there some, catalytic moment where all of a sudden, bang, I have to do this?
I've always, I don't know, I think I always wanted to write. I don't know that there was a catalytic moment. I always told myself stories. I was an only child and was a reader because, my parents were readers and the house was full of books. You can see I'm kind of only comfortable in the vicinity of books. And so I was always telling myself stories to begin with. It was more like understanding that this was something I could actually write down and present to somebody else. That was more like the idea. And that, like when I figured out what Tolkien was doing, I knew I basically wanted to do something like that. Something as daring as that, or as big as that. Not in terms of like wild success, but in terms of the, he kind of set the bar for investment. Like, you don't just toss one of these off. You've got to really think about all the little things, like the flowers, what flowers are they seeing? The bats of Mirkwood. Okay, what are they about? Right. But I was also always from a very early age interested in storytelling and storytellers and people who are good at telling stories. Like, I had a volume of Peter Ustinov reading The Little Prince on vinyl and doing all the voices and things like that. Storybooks and story records, and those sorts of things fascinated me. And so I wanted to be able to do that too, to tell a story. And so in a way, the idea was to write something that I could present to people. It would almost be like a performance, something read to them. Not acted out.
Your performances are kind of, among those of us who've seen them, your performances are kind of legendary. I mean, we're all like, whenever I'm at a convention and somebody says to me, oh yeah, Cisco's reading, I'm like, you have to go see Cisco. You have to go see him read. You have to, and there is nobody to whom I've recommended going to one of your readings who has not thanked me afterwards and said, oh my God, that was astonishing. Granted, it was only one person, but still that person.
Sure, thanks. Right. Sure. Mom was very happy to talk to you on that day too. She was really waffling between going to get the free spaghetti lunch or and you really pushed it over the edge.
He was like, I don't know, it's those little ones. Remember the spaghetti things? And they had like the little, what were they called? They had like the pasta was shaped like little
little alphabet
roller coaster cars or something like that.
Right, SpaghettiOs, yeah, sure.
And anyway,
she passed over SpaghettiOs for me.
That was something. That was an important day. Yeah. So all right. So not to be serious, but to be serious, you got to know Thomas Ligotti, at least over the phone. At least you had some conversations with him. And having read you and Ligotti, in some ways that makes perfect sense to me. But how did that come about? Like did you just call him up one day and you were like, Michael Cisco here?
That's exactly what happened. I just cold called Thomas Ligotti.
It was very noir. It was very like, listen, Ligotti.
That's right. No, I just breathed heavily for a while. And he's like, okay, knock it off, but tough guy. So no, what really happened was I was living in New York. It was the first few years I was living in New York, and you may remember Bob Price. He used to have these get-togethers at his house in Bloomfield, New Jersey. He was living there for a while in a Victorian house, and he would get together with a bunch of people, including C.J. Henderson, by the way, who would show up pretty regularly. Stefan Aletti came a few times, an artist named Tom Brown, and this weirdo named Joe Pulver that you may have heard of would drop in from time to time. And we don't read each other. We don't read our stuff or work in progress to each other and eat pizza and watch movies and just hang out. And I'd mentioned to Bob at one point that I had a manuscript of a novel that I'd written in college. And he asked to see it, and we talked about it a bit. And he said, well, why don't you send it to Legati? He knows a lot of small press stuff. And I was like, huh? Because, it's like I couldn't talk to Legati. I mean, Legati wasn't huge by that. At that time, he just put out Songs of a Dead Dreamer. I don't think the second collection had come out yet. Songs had just come out from Carolyn Graff. I think Golden Griffin did it first.
No, Silver Scarab, I think it was.
Silver Scarab did it.
First,
Okay, so, and so, he wasn't that huge, but he'd been published. A lot of his stuff had been first published in Crypt of Cthulhu. And, I was terrified, but he gave me Legati's address. Legati was still living just outside Detroit at the time. And so I very timidly wrote him a letter, and he wrote me back and said it would be totally fine to talk about the book. I could send him the manuscript, and he'd take a look at it. And he said, well, we could correspond back and forth, but that kind of takes a lot of time. So here's my phone number, and it would be okay if we just talk over the phone. And then again, I'm like, how do I do that? Talk to Thomas Legati, because he was starting to catch hold in the broader horror world at that time. I think his star was starting to rise at that point. People were starting to realize, oh, we have a genius. There's a genius who's right here, right now, doing new stuff. So I was very intimidated, and he, but we talked on the phone a bunch of times, and he was totally approachable. He has no ego at all. If anything, quite the opposite. He's excessively hard on himself and on his work. But we talked a lot, and I was alone in New York at the time, and we connected on various points about writers we liked. Like he loves Thomas Bernhardt, the Austrian writer, and I loved Bernhardt, and so we were able to talk about that back and forth. So yeah, we conversed a lot for a while, and again, he pointed me toward a small press that had just gotten started in Florida, Buzz City Press, which was run by Ann Kennedy of the Silver Web, who's now Ann Vandermeer. And she published, it was the second book she published, the first one being Drayden in Love by Jeff Vandermeer. So
that guy, all right, sorry.
That guy. And so the Divinity Student was the second book she'd published. And she even went and got Harry Morris to do the illustrations. And he, of course, had done a lot of illustrations in Nyctalops for some of the first-run Legati pictures. Some of the first-run Legati stories had appeared in Nyctalops and been illustrated by him. And so to have him illustrate my book was just like,
yeah.
I couldn't believe it. And and Legati went, and I continued to sort of phone correspond for a while. We didn't talk about writing that much, but he did send me manuscripts once in a while to actually look at. And I was just in touch with him again recently by email. I just wanted to see how he was doing during this whole the outbreak. And he's pretty much housebound anyway, so it's not really an issue for him.
Right.
But he seems to be doing well. He doesn't read that much anymore, but it was good to get back in touch with him. What can I say? My respect for him is boundless. I still think he took this, let's face it, by the time he was writing the Lovecraftian, there'd been this Lovecraftian boom in the 80s, and you'd seen a lot of Lovecraftian fiction. And a lot of it was getting pretty tired. It was getting pretty old. And Legati's stuff was like nobody else's out there. It was its own thing. Whether you liked it or not, you had to admit it was its own thing. He had a thing. And he wasn't a gimmick. It was a philosophy. and an aesthetic that was his. And he revitalized this type of fiction. He reinvented it in a way that I think Lovecraft, I mean, I don't know that Lovecraft would have agreed with his premises, but it's in the spirit of Lovecraft when Lovecraft is trying to be philosophical, skeptical. So in a way, Ligotti he sort of reinaugurated a new kind of more existential horror in a way, or nihilistic horror, whatever you want to call it. That kind of originated with him. And it's such an amazing accomplishment to be able to take something as hackneyed by that time as the Lovecraftian horror story and breathe life into it and make it real again and make you read it and understand, oh, this is why I liked this in the first place. This is that kind of thing. And that's what had gotten lost in these retreads, and now that's come back around again. So, yeah, infinite respect to him for having done that.
And if there's a real book that can drive you insane, it's definitely The Conspiracy Against the Human Race.
That's right. That's right. And I was so glad that he did it, that he wrote. It's like, I was like, yes, it's like, whether you agree with the premises of the book or not, to see him do like a philosophical treatise was so, it gave me kind of a genuine, how do I put it? It was thrilling to see it come out.
So I can remember picking up a whole bunch of fanzines like Crypt of Cthulhu, those chapbooks, and reading Spectacles in the Drawer for the first time. Mm-hmm. And then buying all those chapbooks so that I could have a huge backlog of Ligotti stories, because they weren't being published in the mainstream. And then all of a sudden he's on the cover of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And everybody who I knew, it was like, oh my God, where did Ligotti come from? This is a great story. And I'm like, here. This is where he cut his teeth. And, suddenly I'm the cool kid on the block because I knew who Ligotti was before everybody, but only because I'm reading Lovecraft and searching for Lovecraftian material.
Yeah, I mean, he was in zines. He was in essentially zines which were like amateur printed, amateur distributed, without any internet, anything. Like stapled in the middle. Often originally linotype layout, all of that stuff. So so this was legit as anything. And stories I know he wasn't getting paid to get published in things like Crypt. Forget it. These were works of love. These were things that he needed to write, things he had to do, had to say. And I remember like the thrill of seeing new Ligotti stories coming out and saying, oh my God, there's another one. And realizing that we really had something here. It's not to disparage other people in the magazines, but a lot of them were doing stuff that was very, very familiar. And this was somebody who's doing something new.
That's not the way I discovered Ligotti. I actually discovered him here years ago in Nightmare, in this Nightmare collection, and his story Dreams of a Mannequin. Now, I think pretty much every story in this book, it's Nightmare, for those who don't know, edited by Robert Weinberg, Martin Greenberg, etc. Every story in this book is just great, but that one really got under my skin.
Yeah, this die into us.
Yes, die into. Yeah, exactly. That's the phrase I was trying to think.
Die into us. Like, oh my God, Jesus. And so that's.
I stopped. I was like, okay, I'm gonna watch some Disney for a while, and then I'll come back to this.
Yeah, and you knew that was like, that's the thing. You get those phrases that have been very carefully polished and dropped very precisely into place to mess you up. That one I remember very, very fondly. It's one of my favorites. I also love the ones like Professor Nobody's little lectures on the writing of horror and things like that. These are sort of, it's almost like what Poe would do, where he would write something that seems like a scholarly treatise, but then suddenly turns into a story, like The Imp of the Perverse, which is very sort of generic at first, but then, oh, by the way, I murdered a relative and got all his money. And you say, oh, it's that kind of a story. Oops. Ligotti was so keenly self-aware at all times of what you were seeing when you were reading him. There's always very tight control over the effect the story had on you. And to see someone lavish that kind of laser-like care and attention and have it work, again, it was a level of craftsmanship that you didn't always see. A level of care and detail lavished on what is supposedly a throwaway horror story, which I said, no, this is a work of real art. This is a work of great skill.
Right. So, this is kind of related, I guess. I was trying to think of a way to bring this up, but you've kind of done it in talking about Legati. Like, obviously, you're a practicing scholar. You've published, practicing, not professional, practicing. Right? You know, it's all, and you've published articles on weird fiction and such. You've other American writers. So for you, do you see a relationship, or maybe I should ask, what relationship do you see between your scholarly activity and the fiction that you're writing?
There's definitely a sort of reciprocal relationship, but it's writing scholarly stuff and writing fiction is painfully different, for me anyway. Writing fiction, you're writing language that has behavior, and I'm sort of watching what it does and where it wants to go. And so it's like directing a bunch of actors rather than in a piece of scholarly writing where you have to, I don't know how to write scholarly writing that way. It seems like it has to be dissertational and orderly. And I'm always struggling to make it as clear as possible and to keep the ideas from running off in all directions, but to sort of canalize them so that they stay on point. So writing that kind of thing is a real struggle for me, especially if you're trying to do something new. But my interest in weird fiction, I used to be afraid, I guess, that if I tried to explain it or something that it would lose its magic, but I don't really feel that way anymore. Here's what I'd say. I guess I got interested in philosophy, and that interest continued. I've used philosophy in both my scholarly writing and my creative writing. And so it's a touchstone for both, but it's not all in either on either side. It's not like I write about philosophy in a scholarly way and then I write fiction over here. The philosophy kind of changes the way I think, and then I look at things from that perspective, whether I'm trying to write scholarship or not. Otherwise, mainly it's just that writing scholarly writing, enables you to emulate or parody that kind of writing more effectively when you want to in fiction.
Right.
It makes you really good at making phony, very plausible sounding phony sources. Just recently I was looking online and some author was talking about this Swiss Colombian writer with a hyphenated name, Mina Menendez-Krauss. I'm like, I never heard of this writer. And he's like, Borges is hanging out with her and blah, blah, blah. And I'm looking up, like, wait a minute, this person didn't exist. You're making this up. And I'm like looking at there's a bibliography at the end and I'm checking. It's like, there's no publisher by that name. There's no translator by that name. If I run a Google search and I subtract the name of this article writer, I can't find any references to it anywhere. There's no references to her in Spanish. I asked my Colombian friend, Gabriel, about it. It's like, doesn't exist. I was like, okay, nicely played, man. Nicely done. You had me going there. It's like, I wanted to read those books, but they don't exist. So yeah, being a scholar makes you a great phony. You can really fake it.
A grade A phony.
You remember to look up those dates, and also you can just go down those rabbit holes of investigation. I know for a fact that, John, you've done that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Where you just say, oh, there's a little gap in there where I could like put in a little something, or I could put these two together, and oh, look what happens. Like in the background for your stories that are all, I mean, you've done a lot of fiction centered around Catskills area and Dutchman's Creek, right? And that's the creek.
Yeah. No, and that goes back to what you were talking about, right? With thinking about Lovecraft and also M.R. James. You're absolutely right that James is also the master of that, because he's unlike Lovecraft, who's the autodidact. James is the supremely educated, right? But they both wind up doing the same thing, finding these gaps, right? And saying, oh yeah, a little known fact about the pilgrimage to, Poughkeepsie or something like that.
So in my professional field, we have a term for that. We call it the authoritative assertion.
Mm-hmm.
You'll be in a debate with some guy, and he'll like, "Well, I know this because of this paper," and okay, so it's a really obscure fact, and nobody will challenge that guy. And then 8 hours later, everybody's like, "Not only did you get the authority wrong, it says something completely different."
Yeah.
Right. You misread it. Right.
But now it's too late.
Yeah.
The guy has made his point and he's won. So you've lost.
Right. The rhetorical battle has gone to the strong, not necessarily to the correct.
Yeah.
Right. So, Michael, what about maybe you've answered some of this, but I want to talk a little bit more about your own books, but just in terms of books you've reread, what book have you reread the most? Is it The Hobbit or is it something else? What book have you gone back to the most times?
Well, I mean, it might very well be The Hobbit. Books I've reread a lot. I mean, I've reread a lot of William S. Burroughs' books. I've read many of his books like 6 or 7 times. There is something about the way Burroughs gets the spoken word down on paper that, like when I discovered Naked Lunch, I wasn't that much taken with it at first. I had to hear Burroughs read. And then I started to get it. And then when I was reading his work and I started to hear his voice in my head, reading the words, even when I had never heard him read those particular words, that's when I started to say, oh, that's how you write. You kind of talk on paper. It's not quite the same thing as recording your speech, but it's you have to have the sound in your head as you write, or at least that was how it had to be for me. That's how you get the expressive oomph there.
Right. Isn't there a something called the grain of the voice? And I can't remember if it's an article or a textbook or I don't know what, but it strikes me that's what you're talking about, right? Yeah. That particular sense of voice that you get through but it's grain, the paper, right?
Exactly. But for example, like, when so when I read a John Langan story, I hear you reading it.
And you're like, oh God, stop, come on, stop.
Well, it's like with 45 nested narratives, and it's about an 80-page novella, and that's the shortest thing in the book. But yeah,
I'm familiar with that.
I see nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
No, of course not. It's like there's a wonderful
paragraphs are overrated.
It strikes me that he didn't mention any rereads on say Langan or Tremblay books or anything like that.
No, everybody knows that he just rereads Laird Barron.
Oh, that's true. By the way, Tremblay is watching, or at least he was watching. He made some comment on the side, John. If it was you asking the question, that he's out. So.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question actually that we do have to get to, which is if Tremblay, Langan, and Barron got in a fight, who would win?
We all know.
I thought we settled this.
Laird.
No, it has not been settled. It is not.
Laird would tear you to pieces. What are you talking about?
I thought what John told me is that Paul would turn into the Hulk, and that would be.
That's true. If Paul hulks out with his anger, his rage Hulk.
I don't know.
You got to be Laird. I know.
I mean, the man. You basically are best friends with Wolverine. You know that.
He's Wolverine, and I'm some kind of like a member of the Inferior Four or something like that.
Oh, you're Hank McCoy.
Huh?
You're Hank McCoy.
I don't think I'd like to think that, but I think you need like a fatter superhero, whoever that would be.
Well, you got a sort of a night owl feel,
exactly, night owl or something like that. Oh, I can't get this spandex back on.
What about Bouncing Boy?
Yeah, exactly. Bouncing Boy. Everybody's like, seriously? Or shouldn't it be Bouncing Man? And I'm like, shut up.
Hey, just real quick, John. I hear you echo every now and again. Maybe can you turn down your external speakers just a bit?
Let me see. How's that?
As long as you don't yell, you're not echoing.
Okay, I need to yell a lot, Mike. It's who I am. Stop trying to stifle me.
I know it's your interrogation technique, and I put you in charge, and now I'm.
Cisco, do you have some more questions to ask you? So, people don't know as well that at a number of reader cons, I think it was, you were part of their story clinics where people could come to writers. Writers signed up to do this, and aspiring writers or whatever could come and sort of sign up to talk about their story or novel or whatever idea with that writer, and get some advice. And people I know who did that with you were very complimentary and said, "Man, he's so insightful. He really helped me with this story." So, um, not exactly to say advice for new writers, but maybe for yourself, like, are there best practices that somebody who's watching this and is saying, "Oh my God, I'm interested in confusion too. How do I write?" Is there? What do you think about in terms of best practices as a writer?
Um, Best practices. I mean, I could say something kind of from obvious, like the best practice is to write. But what do you write? How do you write? I mean, one of the things I would recommend is that you pay close attention to your mistakes and to mishearings, misseeings, misreadings. Make note of them, and well, really be just aware that there are ideas around you all the time. You're constantly being presented with ideas, or at least potentials for ideas, if you are awake and alert and you're able to, so I always carry a little notebook around with me, and it seems like a pretentious thing to do, I guess, but it's like, it's just because these things, they just come and go. They come and go like that. And so if you can learn to get to snatch them out of the air as they go by, before they go away, and slap them down in the book, then that's your material. And also that level of attention, that's a sort of writerly level of attention. It's that level of attention that you need to be able to create a character, for example. Part of what makes a character who they are is their kind of fleeting way of appraising things that go by. Like, if you're reading a John Langan story and the character's driving to work, it'll be about 20 pages. So, there'll be, but he'll see a traffic sign, or you'll drive by the lake, and it'll bring up a certain sort of, not just a recollection, but also just an association, something like that, which will then help us understand the character, unfold a train of thought, and so you can recreate that for your characters. And then, if you can capture a particular sensation, a subtle one, a fleeting one, in a way that your reader will recognize. Like for me, that was the gold standard. If you could come up with something that people had felt without being able to put into words what that feeling was, or even being fully aware of it, and so your reader goes, "Oh my God, that's exactly what it's like," or "Oh my God, that's happened to me." You then have a bond with the reader that you can then not exploit. What am I thinking about? You've now created a rapport with the reader. You're now on a different level with them. So I'd say, yeah, keep close track of your own impressions, your own sort of fleeting observations about things. And when you get stuck, when you can't go further with something you're working on, that means you found something. It means you run up against something. There's something stopping you from going any further. What is that? Because you found something now. The story doesn't want to do what you want it to do. It wants to go somewhere else. So where does it want to go? So don't treat that as just a problem or a block or a lapse in yourself. It's like, no, you've been out groping in the dark and you've come up against a wall. It's like, okay, I found a building. And you feel around like, okay, the entrance isn't here. It's over here somewhere. And so you keep moving. You put it in the story. You put the block into the story. If I can't talk about this thing, I can talk about the fact that I can't talk about this thing.
I
That's
have to
really
say
good.
that
I
is
really like that.
amazingly awesome advice.
Yeah, that's a great. I intend to steal that. Yeah.
Put it in the story. If I can't talk about this, why can't I talk about this? And there's your drama. That's your character right there.
Right.
So the block, you can turn the block is a gift. Very often it's a gift. It's telling you found something. Don't try to force the story to be something it doesn't want to be. You'll have other chances to write that story if you want to. You'll come back around to that idea. It's not going anywhere. But you've now got something new that you could conceivably find. It could be way more interesting, and then you can go write that other story some other time in another way.
Right. Okay. Cool.
Sort of adjacent to that, Michael, you in another interview you talked about, not with me, but I forget, somewhere else. You talked about reading The Stranger, and
Yes.
that it never occurred to you that you could. Let me look at my notes here. You wrote, "I was shocked by this scene. talk about him looking at people out of the street, taking a shower, smoking a cigarette. You wrote, I was shocked by this scene, but it never occurred to me you could write about something not doing anything. It shocked me, especially because I enjoyed reading it so much. It was like getting inside someone else's time or creating time with someone in much the same way you really do share time with people. And that made me think of this isn't horror at all, but one of my favorite detective series by Lawrence Block's the Matthew Scudder series. And that's one of my favorite things about the series is that it's not just okay, here's the mystery, solve it. It's about his life. It's about he goes around the corner and eats a sandwich and reads the paper here every morning. That sort of thing. So I wonder if you could just I know we want to talk about Joe Pulver in a bit, but I wonder if you could just maybe touch on that.
Yeah, it was like it was the point I was making about Camus was just that I hadn't realized you could write a scene where nobody did anything, where nothing happened, and that was one of those moments that often happens. You really want to find those moments when you possibly can, like reading work that challenges you and that says, oh, you can do that. That's not against the rules. There are no rules. Yeah, it was like, again, this is part of, like we were talking about Ligotti and what makes him great and what makes a lot of great writers in genre, let's say, great, is that they're drawing on influences from outside genre. It's not a question of staying within the confines of genre. It's about looking at what works in any field of literature, whether it's, whatever label it may be. I mean, a book is a book, you read it. And what did the author do that worked? And then what can you do with that? These are all toolkits. These are all groups of techniques. And like advice for writers, again, is just to, you don't think that if you want to write horror, the answer is to go out and read all of Stephen King, all of Clive Barker, and all of Lovecraft and so on. Of course you can do that.
Right.
But you probably are doing that anyway because you want to write horror, because you probably love it and you probably read it. The thing to do is read people you would never have associated with horror in your life. Read Emma by Jane Austen. Read, I know there's Jane Austen and zombies, but the point is that there's not normally that association. Read Dickens, read Proust, read Virginia Woolf, read great writers, and see how great writers write. And they don't care what genre they're in. I mean, Virginia Woolf wrote about ghosts. I mean, there's no barrier there. Read everybody, read widely and promiscuously, and grab whatever works from whatever place you need to grab it from. And you may very well find that you then bring that into the genre, and that's how the genre comes back to life. So it's not just a cookie cutter pumping out the same old stuff over and over and over again. So you can tell it like it with a detective story, as you mentioned. Again, if it's just mystery, murder, payoff, setup, that we know it. What we want to know is the detective. We want to know what their life is like. We want to feel what they're going through.
The mystery is just sort of an excuse of sorts to be in his life in some ways.
Yeah, although, of course, you want the mystery to matter.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what they're doing doesn't matter. It shouldn't just be a pretext. But, it's bigger than the mystery. It's also the man who solves the mystery and why. And the fact is that you're living for a time with this person in this world. And if it is real, you don't care. And the reality is made up of those details that are true of anybody living under any circumstances, whether you're writing a sci-fi book, a fantasy book, a horror book, a mystery book, or whatever you want to call literary fiction, whatever. You still have this moment-to-moment experience of being human. And if we can't relate on that level, then you're not really writing something anybody wants to read.
When you said read promiscuously, read everything, I had Stephen Graham Jones on the show a while back, and he was talking about he's like, I read everything. I was like, everything. He's like, yeah, I read Twilight, I read this or that, or, he just he wants to be exposed to all of that, I guess, and that's admirable.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention him because last year at ReaderCon he was one of the guests of honor, and when he asked for Paul Tremblay to interview him, and during the guest of honor interview, Paul said, okay, I've got a question for you. You used to send me every book that you would send me. I'd get you to sign, and you'd send it back to me. You would write something to the effect of, dear Paul, all of this is true, or something like that, or this is autobiographical, or whatever. It would be like a story about a serial killer, and what were you doing there? And then Stephen killed him. No, but wouldn't that have been great? Just okay. Anyway, but what Stephen said was that when he reached a point in a novel where he wasn't exactly sure what was supposed to happen next, he would just reach for something from his own life, and so the texture of his life was sort of wound throughout these often very strange, science fiction, horror, whatever, autobiography or autobiographically inflected stuff that he was doing. So
yeah, I do that all the time. The books that I write reflect whatever preoccupations I have at the moment. They reflect my thoughts. I'll take what I saw today on the subway and put it in the book, and my thoughts or feelings at a given time, I'll just put it in the book. So in a way, my books are kind of an autobiographical series also.
Right. Is there one of your books that, so I guess that sort of, I don't know if these are the same, if this is two parts of the same question, but is there a book that you wish more people, a book of yours that you wish more people read, a book that you think, man, that was, my heart and soul, and I sure wish that more people paid attention to that. And I guess the adjunct question to that would be, somebody watches this interview and says, oh my God, I got to read this guy. Where do I start?
Well, the first question, gosh, I guess some of the books that I put out around the early 2000s didn't get as much attention as I thought they deserved. Like The Great Lover got a nomination, but the other two books, Celebrant and Member, people don't really talk about very much. And I'd be curious to know what people thought of those books. Those books are important to me. So I guess of the two, Celebrant has a sort of a warm spot in my heart for Celebrant, but I love Member as well. So those are two. Don't say it. Don't say it.
Don't say what, John? Say it. Say it.
I am not saying anything about Cisco's Member.
Thank you.
Oh, all right.
I'm not going to say any more on those lines, but yeah. Sorry, what was the second half of the question?
So just like someone who says, I'd like an introduction, like you yourself, and it's always difficult, right? The writer may not be the best judge of where to start, but
yeah, because they've been all over the place. The one book I can just say the one book that a lot of people seem to respond to very readily would be The Narrator, which is a fantasy book that I published a while back and that's done pretty well. It's not huge and long reading like Animal Money. I think that one has enough sort of familiar fantasy tropes in it that it's not too hard to follow. But I mean, I'm trying to write a fantasy novel about war that isn't morally overly simple, that has the complexity and the nightmarishness. There we go. That I associate with war. So The Narrator might not be a bad place to start. It's pretty recent in my catalog. My older stuff is somewhat more, I don't really write so much like that now as I used. My writing has changed over time. My style has changed a bit. So I would say The Narrator is sort of right in the middle of a lot of the different things I do.
I was going to ask that too, John, so I'm glad you did, but I also wanted to add to that, John, what would you recommend? What book would you recommend of Cisco's that people start with?
Well, as you know, Mike, I haven't actually read any of Michael's works. So.
That's true, but maybe you saw the synopses on Amazon or something.
Exactly. I was like, "Oh, this sounds cool. Prosthetic libido. That's awesome."
There you go.
I actually am a big fan of The Great Lover. But having said that, there's something about the ambition of Animal Money, which is just gigantic, that I really respond to. Michael also wrote a kind of really weird, a haunted house, I guess, novel called The Wretch of the Sun, that Hippocampus put out a couple of years ago. That I read it, and afterwards we were talking about it, and he said to me, "Oh yeah, it's like my take on Shirley Jackson's A Haunting of Hill House," and I was like, "What?" So I
just have a question on that.
Sure.
Mike, it read like Franz Kafka collaborated with M.R. James.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure it did, Rick. Sure it did.
I told Rick he had to say at least one nice thing to.
It's rare when you have a mysterious secret police in a haunted house story.
Yeah, that was the idea. I wanted to have something. There was something about that just made sense to me. That the sense of being watched all the time and guarded over and being constantly in danger from a mysterious organization, a secret police organization, struck me as not unlike the situation of being in a haunted house, and seemed like an interesting way of it seemed like an interesting parallel to explore there. And that is a book that didn't really get a lot of attention at the time. So yeah, I mean, this is a book that I'm very proud of, Rich of the Sun. So
Paul's friends with you guys. He's still watching despite Langen's best efforts. And he says the traitor, and then he said John's a traitor, but also Michael's book. So he's recommending starting with the traitor.
What, that guy? Yeah, the things he'll say when he's not zooming with you. To sort of carry over to what Mike alluded to earlier, Joe Pulver's been having a really rough time of it lately, and
yep.
I know that you guys go way back. When I said that I knew you when you were in color, there's that picture of you in color and Pulver at the 2001, the old Necronomicon, the last of the old I think it was Necronomicons, which I was also at. So I wonder, you guys have, he's been a big supporter of your work, and there were ways in which I feel like you guys, man, your work intersects in a lot of really interesting, or your concerns intersect in a lot of really interesting ways. So I don't know. I thought, and that obviously this is a chance too, right, for everyone else to sort of, talk about Joe as well. But I wanted to give you a chance to do that, to talk about him and I don't know, your relationship with him.
Talk about Joe. Well, again, I met him at Bob Price's house. He would come down all the time. He would come all the way down from Albany, New York, to where he was then living, to hang out. And I think he was working. He wasn't happy in his job at the time, and so this was something that was really, really super important to him. He was much. He was so passionately in love with writing, with poetry, with weird fiction. His particular connection was with Chambers, and he became, a considerable Chambers scholar. He's always had this incredible zest for writing and this deep appreciation and love of writing, and he was always just full of ideas, new projects, things to do. Oh, you should do this, and you should write that, and this, and he's the classic case of that sort of person who couldn't get enough of the stuff and ended up having to do it himself, to write the books himself.
Right.
And what you noticed about Joe's stuff right away was that he's a poet. He's interested in the sound of the words, the layout on the page. Of course, he's notorious for using thousands and thousands of exclamation points, just lathering them on the page, breaking up things, putting them all over, doing stuff with with layout. He was just bursting with the desire to express himself, with as much brio as possible, as much zest, to get all that energy down on the page somehow, to make the page jump and spark, snap, crackle. That's what he was really all about. And he had the same love of other writers too. It was something that it was really exciting to see things take off for him, because he started to sort of flower. He started to come out of his shell and to really emerge as a writer in his own right. And so Joe was and is, a writer who's always growing. That was one thing you noticed about him. Everything he did built on the last thing and kept growing and growing. And I think the intersection that you're talking about is that we're both very concerned with how things sound, with the poetics, to a certain extent with the formal attributes of things, but at the same time making sure there's a strong affective core there of mood, of emotion. And so, we, I think, responded to that in each other, that we were both um, interested in how the words hit. And for us, words had like flavors and textures and grit and bite, resonance and vibe and buzz and crackle. And so it was very sort of sensually exciting to read good writers. So yeah, you couldn't be around Joe and not feel that infectious enthusiasm that he carried with him all the time, and that he managed to infuse into everything he wrote. He had has always had such verve. Um, so and again, a man with no particular ego, no chip on his shoulder, no scores to settle. It was always completely generous, completely wide open, completely self-effacing. Really a wonderful man in every way. And I hate to think of him being in trouble now.
And a great editor too.
Yes.
I was putting together. I was telling Mike this the other day that I was putting together the acknowledgments page or the publication history page for a new collection, and I kind of assumed that most of the publications or the majority of the publications would have been Ellen Datlow, or with Ellen Datlow, but in fact I had just as many, if not more, with projects that Joe had done. And it seems to me, I was looking him up online. He's a half dozen, I want to say, different anthologies in about the last 10 years, I think. And that strikes me as quite the accomplishment. I don't know, you were in the Caligari anthology that he put
Yes.
together, right?
Right.
What about, like, what other ones, or was that the only one, or?
That was the only one I think I can think of offhand. There was another one. Well, wait, Grimscribe's Puppets, wasn't that him?
Grimscribe's Puppets, yeah, the Legati one.
Yeah, I was in that. And then there was another anthology that we were going to do that I ended up pulling the. In fact, Legs was going to be written for a noir anthology that he was putting together.
Okay.
And that one, I ended up. That's why it was sort of in limbo for a long time, because that particular project didn't come together because of his health difficulties. That pretty much derailed it. So I got his permission to take it out and send it somewhere else, and that's how I ended up with Robert Wilson.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine it. In one way, it seems like forever, and in another way, it feels like it just happened. And I was kind of looking some stuff up. I'm sure Kat Pulver, who's watching live, knows all this by heart, with all she's going through with Joe. But I was shocked to realize that it's been about 3 years since all this started.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, what about you, John? How did you meet Joe?
Through I'm sure, as I was saying, it's strange for me to think that Joe and Michael and I were all at that Necronomicon Providence, and I always mean to rummage through my email and see if I can find an old program or something like that. This was 2000, and this was June of 2001, so I don't even know if they emailed us the program or if we just got it when we showed up. So it may be mixed in with the papers out in the garage or something like that. But I've always, I don't remember certain things that well. I wasn't as aware. Joe really, for me, kind of became much more of a presence when he did those anthologies, when he did the when he did the Chambers anthology, and when he did the Legati anthology. I kind of have the feeling that he and Laird may have known each other, and that may be part of how, like online or something like that, and that it may have been one of those, oh, he knows, here's one of Laird's friends, or something like that. But
Yeah.
all of a sudden it seemed that he was just all over the place, right? I mean that and it's absolutely true that there have been few better cheerleaders for the kind of stuff that we do than Joe. I would agree with Michael that he's always been just almost radically open to new stuff. He's always been willing to just go find the next thing, see what the next thing is, and that's not always typical. A lot of us, myself included, probably, we get older, we become more stodgy, conservative, whatever. But no, Joe has just remained open to all kinds of new things. And the last project that I'm aware of he did was the Necronomicon Walk on the Weird Side, I
Right.
think.
Yeah.
Although I know he was also co-editing the Ramsey Campbell tribute anthology. That was something I actually really liked that Joe did, or has done, I should say. Um, I have no problems with yet another Lovecraft anthology because, I'm sure there'll be some good stuff in it. But it was really cool that Joe said, how about Chambers? And how about Legati? And how about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari? And how about Ramsey Campbell? Those things that struck me as I'm trying to think of the right way to put this, but he was using his editorial powers, as it were, to also make certain kinds of arguments about the genre, or to advance a certain more expansive view of the genre. Sure, it's Lovecraft. That's great. But there are also these other figures, Ramsey, say in particular, who are really, as with Joe himself, who are really worth celebrating while we have them.
This isn't in the Sherlock Holmes canon, but I'm a big fan of the Jeremy Brett series, and I think it's the Abbey Grange where, yeah, you too, Michael.
Very much.
Yeah, he's the definitive Holmes, but the reason why this really isn't a change of subject, the reason why I bring this up is because in the Abbey Grange, Holmes and Watson go and visit this. I don't know. He's a guy that's in charge of shipyards, whatever. I don't know. I don't remember. It's been a while. But what really stuck with me was he said he was talking about one of the ship's captains that Holmes was looking for, and he said, in this life, you are sometimes privileged with meeting those who you might call large-souled, who are a privilege to know. That quote really stuck with me, and it really makes me think of Joe. You know.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's
very generous.
Yeah, something to be emulated, right? Like I remember the first ReaderCon I went to, how pleasantly surprised I was by how welcoming everybody was. I had lived in Albany for a few years in the 90s, and I had SUNY Albany used to have a writers, actually they still do, the New York State Writers Program, and each semester they would bring about a dozen different writers to the school. So I had a chance to meet people like William Styron and whatever. And man, they were jerks. They were, I mean, look, Sophie's Choice is still a great novel. I apologize, or, but Styron was a jerk, and a lot of other people were jerks. And when it would have been so easy for them to be gracious, but so often in that setting anyway, what I found was so many of those usually older male white writers, that there was this sense that there was a limited amount of oxygen in the room, and they weren't going to share it with you. The cold equations, right? You shouldn't have gotten on this spaceship in the first place, buddy. And going to ReaderCon, say, just to name one, it was amazing. People were just so welcoming, and people were just like, oh, you're a freak just like us. Come on, come to the bar. That's most sacred of spot in conventions, and Joe embodies that kind of large spirit. He's not a big man. I mean, if you meet him, he's not a very big guy, and yet when I think about him, he seems enormous. Like there's this sort of I don't know, disjunction between my mind's eye of Joe, where he's this sort of titan, and the actual Joe, who's a little bit shorter than I am.
but even in the physical presence, I think of him so many times at Necronomicon or film festival, standing outside the Bilton or another hotel and everything, chain smoking and talking to whatever writer, editor, fan walked by, and so passionately. I have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with Joe in face-to-face meetings like this. The second best thing to being in the room. And but when I think of Joe, I think of him at one of those conventions. Outside the front door, just really being so passionate and cheering people on, and Same thing as, oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, you need to do that. That kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, um, so yeah. Anybody else want to chip in anything? Pete, I know you're very, very good friends with Joe as well.
Well, you know, it's just I lost Willem last year,
Yeah,
and you know, I lost him. We lost him.
We lost
Like,
him.
Willem,
yeah,
Willem and I spent a lot of time talking back and forth and sending books to each other, and you know, I love buying books. He loved getting books in the mail. We were, you know, perfect for each other. Just because, like, oh yeah, here I found this. Oh, I want to read that. Okay, great. And so there, I had a long, hard time dealing with the loss of Willem, and now I'm sitting here and I'm thinking back on my relationship with Joe, which you know is not difficult to think about. In a lot of ways, you know, he's kind of a literary father figure for me. And I don't mean to be narcissistic about that, but he starts off, writing Lovecraftian fiction, um, and publishing with Chaosium, and I buy his book, and he's in Crypt of Cthulhu, and I have to contact him because I'm publishing the whole Legacy of the Reanimator book, and just little things that tied me to him. And finally, we start talking, and yes, we had a lot of misfires. There were things that I wanted to write for that had already filled up. That he was like, if you had been here 6 months earlier, we would be talking about this.
Right.
And and then we start working together on little things, and I got one of his last stories before this all happened for the Chromatic Court, which it's a wonderful piece of fiction dealing not with the King in Yellow, but with Casilda. And I love the story, and I had whole reams of things I wanted to do. I wanted him to go back and revisit some of the characters he had in his Reanimator story, his Nazis, and do a sequel to that. And then all this happens, and I'm not good with emotions, but I look at the collections and the stories and the novels, and I'm sitting here going, I know there's more, and it's not just what Cat has. There's more up here.
yeah,
Yeah.
And because we've talked about it, I've heard him talk about it, and he likes to call me a storyteller because I really don't like writing. I like telling stories, and I like sitting around the bar telling stories. That's what I like to do. That's what my preferred medium. Writing is a way for me to do it, to reach more people, to get it out because there's nobody else around. Joe writes because he has to, and he has so much more to give us, and I want to see it. I want to see those words on a page, and I want to hear him talk about them, and I want to hear him read them. So yeah, I'm kind of emotional right now, and when this is all over, I'm going to go outside for a walk. But
Well, I hope that Cat will play this for Joe,
yeah,
and that he can hear this and get his ass back here.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. I've been trying to remind myself, that it was a few years ago we thought he had a brain tumor.
Yeah.
And that was, I mean, what horrifying news that was, and it was whatever it was. And it's not to say that wasn't serious. It's obviously not to say this isn't serious, but not to be Pollyanna, but just that I agree with you that there's a lot of stuff still up here that I think we all want access to. And Pulver, come on, get it together, get up off the bed, let's go.
Best case scenario, at some point in the future, he's sitting back in his office at home and watching this. I hope that's the case.
Right, and he's like, "Son of a, I will kill you, Langan," and anger issues.
Indeed.
We were talking about making up sources or writers before.
Yeah.
And he pulled off one of the greatest tricks with his novel Nightmare's Disciple. He invents a story by Lynn Carter.
Yeah.
It sounds so accurate. And all of us Lovecraftian collectors were going, I never heard of this one. I'm going to find it on the internet.
Yeah.
I'm going to see if I can buy this fanzine on Bookfinder or whatever.
Right. I have every Thongor of Lemuria.
I read that book several years before I ever met Joe, and the thing that I remember with that book is it's not like it's a Lovecraftian murder mystery of sorts, but the thing that I most remember about that book is that one of the characters, she goes home and she tries to figure out what she's going to read that night. And one of the things that flashes through her mind is Winter Prey by John Sandford. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know who this guy is, but he loves to read.
Yeah.
So.
Right. So, I read Nightmare's Disciple, which comes out from Chaosium, and then I read Ghoul by Michael Slade. And the two books are very, very similar. And I'm like, this book is much better. It went where it needed to go, where the Michael Slade book reads like it was written by committee. And it turns out that that's actually true.
The other thing
not
is,
one person.
Nightmare's Disciple is a pre-internet book. That the police have to go to this guy who's a collector of Marvel Comics and Lovecraft.
Yeah.
And who does that sound like? It's Joe.
Right.
Yeah, that was the other thing about that book that I told Joe. I wanted to visit that bookshop for real and talk to those guys. I don't know. Does anybody else want to throw out anything? I
gotta say, Mike. I'm not trying to be a downer here, but I really I'm having a hard time with this. I feel like I'm listening to a eulogy. You know what I mean?
Well,
I have so much more hopes that he's going to recuperate. It's like,
well, actually, what I told John the other day when we did the video test, Matt, was that so many times we remember people and we say things like these after they're gone, and I hear what you're saying, but I really wanted to do this for a bit today in the high hopes that he is going to hear this. So if that makes sense, Matt.
Right, because I think the first thing I read by Joe was a Rainfall Books chapbook. I think it was The Night Music of Oak Dean. And and I could be completely off on this. I think it was based on some ideas from Lumley. Am I right about that, Pete?
Yes.
But it was so much better. It's like, what the, and not nothing against Rainfall Books. It's like, what the hell is this just doing in a Rainfall Books chapbook? It's so good.
It was a sequel to a story by Lumley.
Right.
I think The Horror at Oak Dean.
Yes, that's right.
Well, and, what we're talking about here is Joe going quickly through the cycle that a lot of weird fiction writers do. They find Lovecraft, they write Lovecraft, they find Lovecraft disciples, they write Lovecraft disciples, and then they find a way to move on and do their own thing. And I think it's an important process to go through to I don't know, ape the masters.
Well, everyone does that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
everyone
think
starts
so.
out by trying things out. What I
Right.
noticed, the nice thing about the way I met Joe was that I was introduced to a lot of his fiction with him reading it to me out loud in a room, you know, with a bunch of folks hanging out. And
And he did so well, and he was always scared to death ahead of time.
yep, yeah, you could always
Yeah.
tell he was petrified, and he was always totally focused. He had that stage fright attention, but you could also tell there was this extraordinary care with the words, and you could see that poetic. You know, he couldn't hide it. He couldn't hide his poetic instincts. That, you know, the language had to be alive, and he was just kind of quieting himself down so the language could speak. And if you have that relationship to language, then you're never going to be in anybody else's shadow, really, because you're responding to things like notes and timbres rather than affect, or you know, aping somebody else's attitude or sensibility. You're using the instruments and the notation to express yourself. That's what Joe was doing from the start.
Yeah, and to Matt and anybody listening now or later who felt that I was trying to create a eulogy here, I apologize, but it was the thought was exactly the opposite. You know, Cisco's going to be here, Langan's going to be here. They've been friends with this guy for a long time too. You know, like Pete, Matt, me, Rick, and so on. And it's a good opportunity to hopefully say some words of appreciation and how much we love this guy, in the high hopes that he's going to hear them at some point.
Mm.
So, you know, it's always nice to say nice things after someone passes, but they don't know about that, you know. So,
Yeah, I
You don't
think
have to. You don't have to worry about that, Mike. Don't worry about it.
okay.
it's not. We don't say enough. We don't say enough good things about each other. You know, I mean, just as a general rule. And yeah, I'm glad to have this opportunity to say these nice things about Cisco. I never will again, and I will insist this be destroyed. This like, I'm going to try to send some kind of virus through the system that destroys this. You know.
I wouldn't talk about spreading viruses publicly on Zoom at this moment, John.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't thought about that. Okay. Yeah.
Computer virus, you meant. Computer virus.
Computer virus. I meant. Nice, Cisco. Way to bring it down. Good. Yeah.
There was that clause in the contract I had with Ross that said I could never say anything nice about you, John.
And you've stuck to that clause. Yeah, that's you know. All right, wait. So I have one more thing. One more Cisco thing.
Sure.
You know, as you all know, Cisco is famed for his Werner Herzog impression.
No, I am not.
Before we leave,
Did not actually know that, but yeah, okay.
Oh yeah, there was nothing funny. I was in a restaurant a few years ago with Cisco, Jack Haringa, and Nick Kaufman all doing their Werner Herzog impressions, where they were talking about the Thai food that we were going to eat, as Werner Herzog would talk about the Thai food you were going to eat. So, you know, so how would Werner Herzog talk about, say, like a salmon dinner? That's how I want to end.
And you want me to do this on the fly?
Exactly. I want you to do that.
We need archival proof. Yes.
Yeah, and was he not frightening as hell in that Jack Reacher movie? I mean, everything else was kind of forgettable, but Herzog was like, oh my god, I never want to meet this guy, this character.
Oh no, the bounty hunting is a strange profession, or whatever it is.
You chew off your fingers, and you know. So yes, I'll cede the floor to Michael Cisco.
All right.
No, I don't know. I don't know if I can do it on the fly. I'm pretty tired, but I mean, I can give it a. It's like, what am I talking about?
Like a salmon dinner. A salmon dinner. Werner Herzog gets to have a salmon dinner.
Did you open up the dictionary and point out a word, or?
No, that just occurred to me, and I just thought, you know, that's exactly the kind of random thing that Herzog would talk about.
Okay.
Then I gazed into the glazed eye of this salmon that was served to us. It was impossible for me actually to eat it. It was like looking into the glazed eyes of my mother's corpse when she died of tuberculosis when I was very small. I remember it was a Sunday. It was a Sunday. My father took me outside to beat me, as he invariably did on Sunday afternoons. And apparently my mother was inside, expiring of tuberculosis. She, when we were brought inside, she said it was the happiest day of her life. She had been looking forward to it. The tuberculosis had been ravaging her for months. She was merely a skeletal figure at that time. And it was a relief for us all to see her finally perish. And when I looked into the eyes of that salmon, the memory came back to me entirely too forcefully. I told them to send it back. I told them I never wanted to see salmon on my plate again. I told them, you take the salmon back, and if you bring me salmon again, there will be 27 bullets in you before you turn the corner, and at least one of them will be mine. Is that all right?
I'm just glad I was muted because I was laughing my ass off.
I know, saying we got a new Cisco novel right on here. We gotta go.
Yeah, I had to mute myself as well. That was.
Nobody would have been able to hear you if we hadn't muted ourselves.
Because the only way to get you to mute yourself is to imitate Herzog. I guess I'm going to have to do it all the time. Do that work in real life too?
Nice, very nice. Yeah.
Well, yeah, of everything we talked about, that might have been the most important right there. So
right there, it's going to be right.
Everybody's going to be like, yeah, he interviewed Cisco, but just go to the end.
Just skip the whole thing,
No, you have to tell them that there's another Herzog impersonation in the middle somewhere.
Right, just listen very carefully.
If you listen very carefully, you'll hear the other Herzog.
Yeah, oh, you didn't hear it? You missed it, man. You better go back and listen to that again.
You needed to
Well,
listen.
everybody also needs to see the action figure parade that you guys did, because that was hilarious.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so everybody make sure and watch that.
I like that it's bracketed by those things, right? We've got the action figures at the beginning, Herzog at the end.
Yeah.
John, you just started doing that with Godzilla, and I'm like, oh, no. I got this.
You're like, I'll see your kaiju and raise you.
Exactly.
Now, did any of you ever watch the movie Waiting for Guffman?
Yeah.
The guy was bragging about his collection of Remains of the Day action figures.
Remains of the Day?
Yeah, isn't there, what's the one? Is that the one where they have the My Dinner with Andre action?
Yeah, yes. They can, of course, talk about whatever you want them to talk about.
Very nice. Well, now that he's in Star Wars owned properties, I mean, Herzog himself would have an action figure now. If he doesn't already.
Or an in-action figure.
Well, yes. He would just stare at you, intimidating you.
Or he'd be, maybe he'd be in documentary mode with all his equipment and everything.
Oh yeah, right, exactly.
I would love to watch the Herzog documentary of The Mandalorian, of his part in The Mandalorian.
I'm sure there'll be. Well, he can't. The licensing would be a pain. That's the only issue. Otherwise, you have to sneak it out.
There was a funny story though that Herzog in The Mandalorian yelled at. I think it was Jon Favreau or whoever. You heard about that, right? Because they had the little baby Yoda puppet or animatronic figure. And they were like, should we use this or should we just go CGI? And Herzog went off on them and he was calling them cowards and he was saying, use the puppet.
Don't be such cowards.
Quote Herzog,
if you were a real man, you'd be using the puppet.
I feel that suddenly Herzog and Ligotti have converged, right? And Herzog making a Thomas Ligotti-esque puppet sort of.
Now we're talking. That's a movie.
That is indeed.
Michael Cisco, hey, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been great. Really appreciate it.
My love and respect to everybody here. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, John, thank you for interviewing him for me. Really appreciate that.
So look, Mike, I trust our debt is squared now.
We're getting close.
My God. All right.
Matt Carpenter, you've got a prize.
Yes, remember, easingprizes@gmail.com and put Arkham in the subject heading if you want to win Arkham Detective Agency.
Okay. Well, I hope that everyone's staying safe and staying inside at least as much as you can. So it's really been great to see you guys, all of you, but I haven't seen Cisco or John for a while, so great to see you guys, especially too.
Good to see you too, man.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye.